Greetings, this is Father Harvey Henderson at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Grand Forks, continuing with the careful reading of Matthew's Gospel. This week, an important turning point in the Gospel, chapter 16, three stories that we have here. The first concerns the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These were groups of Jews that existed at the time of Jesus. Judaism was not a unified society in which everybody was the same. The Pharisees were sort of the fundamentalists of the group, paid careful attention to the law and the interpretation of the law given to Moses on Mount Sinai, but also had their own oral traditions that they brought forward from one generation to another. A century after the time of Jesus, these oral traditions would be written down in a book called the Mishnah. The Sadducees were kind of wealthy, upper-class Jews, and usually the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not get along with one another. So this is unusual that Matthew puts them both together here in this confrontation. Jesus has now moved north, far from the centers of power. He's up in Capernaum, north of the Sea of Galilee, and the Jewish leadership here is trying to trip him up. And it's important to note here that it's really the Jewish leadership and not the Jewish people as a whole that are in confrontation with Jesus. So they try and catch him up by accusing him of perhaps being a false prophet or in league with the devil. And Jesus just responds when they ask for a sign. Well, you can tell the signs about the weather, the red sky in the morning and the red sky at night, but you can't seem to understand the signs of the coming of the kingdom of God. And he refers them back to the sign of Jonah, who spent 3 days in the belly of the whale, a clear sign for some of Jesus and his 3 days that he spent in the tomb after his death and before his resurrection. So the Jewish leadership were blind to the signs that were around them. And then Jesus moves on without engaging them further. He then goes on to warn his disciples of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the disciples at first, as they have done before, misunderstand what Jesus is saying. He thinks he's talking literally about bread, but he goes on to chastise them a little bit and explain that he's talking about the leaven, which is the false teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, not having to deal with bread in and of itself. Leaven here is an important symbol in Jewish society at the time of the Passover, when the people were about to be led out of Egypt by Moses. They were ordered on that evening to sacrifice and to eat the Passover lamb, to spread the blood of the lamb on their doorposts so the angel of death would pass over them and not strike them dead. And they were ordered to take only unleavened bread. In other words, they didn't have time. They were in a hurry. They didn't have time for the regular leaven in the bread to rise. So this symbol of unleavened bread talks about hastiness and being ready to move as soon as it was possible on that Exodus journey. So pointing a little bit forward here. Verses 13 through 20 are really a focal point of chapters 14 through 17. And here we have a very important passage, Peter's declaration of Jesus as the Messiah. Judaism believed that God would send an anointed king. This is what the word Messiah means, literally the anointed one, in the same way that the prophet Samuel anointed David by pouring oil on his head as a sign that David would be the chosen king of Israel at that time, about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. So by the time of Jesus, they had been under foreign rule for close to 600 years, and their hope was that God would send another anointed one, another Messiah, and their hope was for another warrior like King David to come and free them from their Roman oppressors. This was a common belief that this Messiah, this deliverer, would rescue them and bring justice and peace to the land in which they lived. The prophet Micah in chapter 5 speaks about this if you want to read more about the expectation of this anointed one. So this would then fulfill the scriptures and bring God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. So Jesus asks this question again in Caesarea Philippi, far up north, away from Jerusalem. Who do people say that I am? And he uses this phrase again, the Son of Man. We've come across this before. Jesus often uses this phrase to refer to himself. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, the vision of the end time is when one like a Son of Man will come to judge the living and the dead at that particular time. So the disciples' answers are reasonable. Some say perhaps John the Baptist resurrected, or some would say Elijah or Jeremiah. The Elijah reference is interesting because Elijah in the Old Testament is whisked off to heaven, remember from Sunday school days perhaps, in a flaming chariot. He doesn't die. And so the belief in Judaism is that before the Messiah comes, Elijah himself will return to prepare the way, much like John the Baptist did for Jesus. So John the Baptist is our Elijah. But Peter says, no, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. A very high confession. You are this anointed king who has come to save us, and you are a Son of God. Not in the sense that we understand this as the second person of the Trinity, but rather a term of relationship. David was thought to be a son of God because of his relationship of obedience. In Psalm 2, chapter 7, we see this reference as well to the king who is the obedient one, can be a son of God. So here it's a term of relationship and not necessarily of divine status. But this is indeed a very high confession. And then Jesus allows that this was revealed to Peter, that he didn't figure this out on his own. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to him. And then Jesus commissions Peter to be the rock upon which the church will be built. There's a play on words here. Peter's name is changed, much like Abraham's name is changed from Abram to Abraham when he is commissioned by God. Cephas here becomes Peter, which in Greek means the rock. So Jesus is going to build a community, an ecclesia, a church. There's only 2 times in Matthew's gospel that this term is used. Then we have the turning point in the gospel story here in verses 21 through 28. Jesus predicts his death, and Peter, the one who had just confessed him as Messiah and Son of God, now turns and rebukes Jesus. You can imagine they must have had a very close relationship, Jesus and Peter, if Peter could speak so freely to him and to say, in response to Jesus' announcement that he must suffer and die and then be raised from the dead, my God, surely this will not happen to you. This cannot be. And Jesus then responds again in a fairly harsh term, calling Peter Satan. Get behind me, Satan, because you're thinking about human things and not about godly or divine things. So Jesus does fit this bill of the Messiah. Yes, he will journey to Jerusalem. And yes, he is the coming king. The kingdom of God is coming, and the Son of Man will be exalted as the king, but he'll be exalted on the cross, not in the way that the disciples thought. This will not be a warrior king, but rather a servant king that Jesus comes as. Excuse me. So Peter says that this is all nonsense. And then Jesus goes on. This is the first of three predictions that Jesus makes of his impending suffering, death, and resurrection. And then this familiar image that those who want to be my disciples must take up the cross and follow me. Every one of his followers would have known what the image of the cross meant. This was a very public and painful and shameful way of dying in the Roman Empire. So they would have understood what taking up the cross means, that you too might have to be prepared to die if you want to be my disciple. So you have to give up your life. You have to focus only on me and the mission, to deny yourself and pick up the cross. I had a good friend back in seminary who lost his arm in a farm accident, and when folks said that must be a terrible cross to bear, he would say, no, it's not. The cross that I bear is whenever I decide to follow Jesus. Losing my arm was painful, and I still suffer the effects of that. But it's not the cross. The cross is not something that's thrust upon us by some kind of accident or illness, but it is a conscious decision to pick it up and to follow Jesus. So those who want to be my disciples must do these kinds of things, to lose themselves and be prepared to follow me. This is the message that Jesus has for his disciples here. So Peter becomes here in Matthew's gospel the keeper of the keys. Familiar image. Peter and the butt of many religious jokes about the keys to the kingdom and the pearly gates. This is not really what Jesus is talking about here, although we can still continue to joke about it. But the one who holds the keys here, Jesus says, is the one who binds things on earth and looses things on earth. In other words, is the one who says what teaching is authoritative here on earth and what is not. It's easy to see how the Roman Catholic Church takes up this image of Peter, and the popes throughout history sitting in the seat of Peter, having this same kind of authority, binding and loosing, saying what is authoritative and what is not. This is what it's meant by the keys to the kingdom, not deciding who gets into heaven and who does not, but what kind of teaching is authoritative and what is not. This is what is meant by the keys, by holding the keys to the kingdom. So this is Jesus then as Son of God, as this one who is obedient to the will of God, and then calls his disciples to, for the first of three times, to follow him along this particular path. From this point in the gospel, Jesus then begins the journey towards the city of Jerusalem, where he will meet his fate, his arrest and trial and execution and resurrection in that holy city, a story with which we're all very familiar. So Peter becomes the chief disciple here. Peter, again, however, a very human person, one who often acts before he thinks. Recall on the night of the trial that Peter denies ever knowing Jesus, and then afterwards Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, confronts Peter with that question in John's Gospel three times. Peter, do you love me? And then the command to feed my sheep. So shortly after, by the middle of the 2nd century, the Bishop of Rome, in the church district of Rome becomes the chief bishop, and that tradition continues then. So chapter 16, an important turning point in the gospel story. That's all for this week. Take care and be well.